By the end of that afternoon in Seoul, the challenge was no longer discussed. There were no cheers, no raised voices, and no announcement of victory. Witnesses say the outcome was understood before anyone spoke, because one person had come to prove something, and the other had come to remove the need for proof. What followed lasted less than a minute. What remained has lasted more than 50 years. The room was not large, but it was deliberate. A rectangular indoor hall in Seoul, its walls plain, its floor polished enough to show the reflection of bare feet. There were no banners announcing a contest. No posters. No seating arranged for spectacle. Chairs lined the edges, occupied by instructors, officials, and a few invited observers who understood that this was not meant to be public entertainment. It was 1972. Taekwondo in Korea was not merely a martial art, it was a national symbol, disciplined and codified, backed by institutions that believed deeply in structure and hierarchy. Demonstrations were common, challenges were not. When they occurred, they were usually resolved long before anyone entered a room. This one had not been. The air carried a peculiar stillness. People spoke in low tones, then stopped speaking altogether. Shoes were placed carefully near the entrance. No one crossed the center of the floor. The space was being preserved, as if something fragile might break if the wrong foot stepped forward too early. Witnesses later said they noticed the silence first. Not the respectful quiet of a ceremony, but the kind that comes when expectations have already collided, and no one is certain which version of the day will survive. This was not a tournament setting. There would be no judges raising flags, no points counted aloud. What had brought everyone here was simpler and heavier, a question that had traveled quietly through dojangs, training camps, and administrative offices. A question about methods, about philosophy, about whether mastery was defined by system or by something harder to name. The hall held people who already believed they knew the answer. Outside, Seoul moved as usual. Buses passed. Vendors called out. Students walked with books under their arms. None of that entered the room. Inside, time slowed, as if the afternoon had agreed to wait. The challenger's presence was already known, though she had not yet stepped forward. Her reputation preceded her more strongly than her footsteps ever could. The authority behind her attendance, formal, institutional, was understood by everyone seated along the walls. The other presence was quieter. No announcement marked his arrival. No escort cleared the floor. There was only a subtle shift in posture among those who noticed him first, a straightening of backs, a pause in movement. He did not examine the room as if measuring it. He accepted it, as though the dimensions were irrelevant. No one gave instructions. No one explained rules. That absence, witnesses say, was the first indication that this would not unfold as expected. Because when rules are unnecessary, it usually means someone believes the outcome does not depend on them. The floor remained empty, and the room, as several observers later recalled, felt like it was holding its breath, not in anticipation of action, but in recognition that something irreversible had already begun. She did not enter with hesitation. Those seated along the walls recognized her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence had long been familiar in rooms like this. Training halls, examination floors, demonstration platforms. She had stood on all of them without losing. Her record was not recited aloud. It did not need to be. In 1972, her position was unusual, but not symbolic. She was not presented as an exception or a novelty. She was presented as a champion, undefeated, disciplined, and officially endorsed. Her success had been measured repeatedly, under rules that were clear and publicly accepted. She represented a system that valued repetition, structure, and visible dominance through form. Those who trained under her spoke of precision. Those who faced her spoke of inevitability. Her challenge was not issued in anger. Witnesses emphasized this point years later. There was no insult exchanged, no raised voice, no attempt to provoke. The challenge was procedural, almost administrative. A question framed through authority rather than emotion. If methods differed, they would be compared. If claims existed, they would be tested. That framing mattered. It meant retreat would not be interpreted as wisdom. Silence would not be neutral. To decline was to concede, not personally, but philosophically. And for those who had sanctioned this encounter, philosophy was exactly what was at stake. She stood near the edge of the floor, posture straight, eyes forward. Her uniform was immaculate, folded with care. Nothing about her suggested doubt. Her breathing was steady. Her movements were economical, trained to eliminate waste. There was confidence in her stillness, but also expectation. She had prepared for resistance. She had prepared for speed. She had prepared for strength. What she had not prepared for, though no one could have named it at the time, was absence. Absence of hostility, absence of contest, absence of anything to push against. Several instructors later admitted that they assumed the demonstration would be prolonged. Exchanges. Adjustments. A gradual revelation of superiority. That was how victories were normally understood. Accumulated, visible, undeniable. Her role in that expectation was central. If there was to be a test, she was its instrument. If there was to be an answer, it would pass through her body. And yet, as she waited, something subtle began to shift. Not in her stance, but in the room. The silence lengthened. No signal came to begin. No official stepped forward. No authority asserted control. The structures that usually framed such moments remained unused, like tools set aside. For the first time that afternoon, the champion adjusted her footing, not to prepare for attack, but to recalibrate to uncertainty. Witnesses noticed it because it was rare. And in that moment, before anything had occurred, the balance that had seemed so stable began, quietly, to loosen. Those who noticed him first could not later agree on the exact moment he entered the hall. There was no single point of arrival that memory could hold on to. Some said he had been standing near the wall for several minutes. Others believed he appeared only after the champion had taken her place. What everyone agreed on was that nothing in the room shifted dramatically when he arrived, and that was precisely what unsettled them. Bruce Lee did not behave like a man answering a challenge. He did not warm up. He did not stretch. He did not test the floor with his feet. He stood with his arms relaxed, posture neither rigid nor casual, as if his body had already resolved the question of readiness long before that day. His gaze moved briefly across the room, not assessing individuals, not measuring distances, but acknowledging space, walls, floor, air. Witnesses later described the sensation as disorienting. They were accustomed to competitors who announced intent through preparation. What they saw instead was containment. Nothing leaked outward. Nothing invited reaction. There was no visible tension in him, and yet the tension in the room increased. Someone near the back cleared their throat, then stopped. Another adjusted their seat, then froze mid-motion, as though aware that sound itself might become intrusive. The silence was no longer passive. It had weight. Lee did not speak to the champion. He did not address the instructors. He did not look toward anyone who might have been waiting to formalize the exchange. In settings like this, authority was usually clear. Rank was established by uniform, by title, by institutional position. Lee wore none of these markers. His clothing was simple, unadorned, offering no visual claim to status. And yet, slowly, attention began to organize itself around him, not because he demanded it, but because nothing in him seemed to need confirmation. One instructor later recalled realizing that Lee had already accepted whatever outcome might occur. That realization unsettled him more than confidence ever could have. Confidence could be challenged. Acceptance could not. The champion watched him now. Her expression remained composed, but her focus sharpened. She was accustomed to opponents who mirrored her intensity, who met her gaze with either defiance or calculation. What she encountered instead was neutrality, an absence of emotional surface. It was not dismissive. It was complete. Lee finally stepped forward, not abruptly, not ceremoniously. The movement was small, economical, as though distance itself were irrelevant. He stopped well short of her, leaving space between them that felt intentional rather than cautious. Still, no signal came. The absence of rules, of introductions, of formal commencement began to register more clearly. This was not being framed as a contest. It was being allowed to resolve itself. Witnesses later said that in that moment, they understood something without being able to articulate it. Whatever was about to happen would not unfold according to expectations formed by rank, record, or reputation. Because one person had arrived to demonstrate superiority. The other had arrived to demonstrate nothing at all. And in that imbalance, quiet but unmistakable, the room began to sense that the question it had gathered to answer was already losing its shape. No one gave a signal. That detail appears in nearly every account, regardless of who tells it. There was no clap of hands, no verbal cue, no formal bow exchanged to mark the beginning. What occurred began not with permission, but with recognition, an unspoken agreement that delay itself had become unnecessary. The champion adjusted her stance. It was a minimal change, almost instinctive, aligning her center, grounding her weight. Years of training expressed themselves in that movement alone. It was efficient, practiced, and unmistakably professional. Across from her, nothing changed. The stillness was not passive. It was held, contained with intent. Several witnesses later said that the absence of visible preparation was the most unsettling aspect. It suggested not unreadiness, but completion, as if all preparation had already been absorbed and no longer needed expression. The distance between them closed. How it happened is where accounts begin to diverge, not in outcome, but in sequence. Some recall a forward step. Others insist there was no step at all, only a sudden collapse of space. What is consistent is the brevity. The exchange did not unfold. It concluded. There was no flurry of movement. No clash of techniques. No escalation. A single, controlled action, so contained that some observers initially believed they had missed it, ended the question that had brought everyone into the room. Balance was taken. Structure was interrupted. Not violently, not dramatically, but completely. The champion did not fall hard. She was not struck down. There was no spectacle of defeat. Instead, there was a moment of disorientation, a sudden loss of alignment that forced her to step back, then stop. Her posture changed. Not collapsed, but altered. The confidence that had once filled the space around her withdrew inward, replaced by concentration so intense it bordered on disbelief. The room remained silent. This silence was different from before. It was no longer anticipatory. It was reflective, as though everyone present were replaying the moment internally, trying to locate what had happened within their own understanding of movement and force. No follow-up came. No second demonstration. No confirmation strike. No insistence on acknowledgement. The absence of continuation was decisive. It made clear that what had been shown was sufficient, and that repeating it would serve no purpose. The demonstration had not been designed to overpower, but to answer. Once answered, the exchange was complete. The champion straightened slowly. Her eyes did not search the room. They remained fixed on the space between them, as if examining something invisible that had briefly revealed itself and then vanished. No one spoke. No one applauded. No one moved to reframe what had occurred. Because there was nothing left to frame. Witnesses later said that the most striking detail was not the action itself, but the restraint that followed it. The refusal to claim victory. The refusal to expand upon what had already been understood. In that refusal, the demonstration achieved its final form. Not as a contest won, but as a question rendered unnecessary. The silence that followed was not imposed. It arrived naturally, as if sound itself had withdrawn to avoid interfering with what people were processing. No one rushed forward. No official stepped in to declare resolution. The structures that normally reclaimed control after a demonstration, explanations, acknowledgments, procedural closure, remained unused. The champion stood still. Those nearest to her later said her breathing had changed. Not labored, not hurried, simply deliberate. She was no longer preparing to act. She was recalibrating. The expression on her face did not register embarrassment or anger. It registered attention, sharpened and inward-facing, as though the external room had temporarily ceased to matter. Belief does not collapse loudly. It withdraws. The instructors seated along the wall did not exchange glances. They did not whisper. Each seemed to retreat into private assessment, replaying what they had seen against what they had taught, what they had believed, what they had defended. What unsettled them was not the outcome. Outcomes were familiar. What unsettled them was the or surprise. Minutes passed, and none of those explanations held. The action had been too economical, too complete, to reduce without distortion. The champion finally lowered her stance, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A shift of weight. A release of tension in the shoulders. The kind of adjustment made by someone who understands that pressing forward would no longer clarify anything. She did not speak. Neither did the man who had demonstrated. That mutual silence carried more authority than any verbal concession could have. It reframed the encounter from confrontation to instruction, though no instruction was offered. The room understood something then. This had not been about proving superiority. It had been about exposing excess. Excess movement. Excess intention. Excess certainty. What remained after those were removed was unsettling in its simplicity. The absence of reaction from the demonstrator was the final, quiet dominance. He did not linger to absorb attention. He did not look to ensure understanding. He behaved as though the responsibility for interpretation belonged entirely to those who had witnessed. People began to stand, not all at once, and not with urgency. Chairs moved softly. Shoes were retrieved without sound. No one attempted to restart discussion or salvage hierarchy through explanation. The champion remained where she was until most had begun to leave. When she finally turned away from the center of the floor, witnesses say she did so slowly, with precision unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. Her movements were no longer oriented toward assertion. They were oriented toward inquiry. That shift, quiet and internal, marked the true end of the encounter. Because what had collapsed that afternoon was not reputation, nor record, nor authority. It was certainty. And certainty, once gone, does not return in the same form. Years passed before the afternoon found its name. At first, it existed only in fragments, half-remembered details exchanged quietly between instructors, mentioned briefly after class, or recalled late at night when conversation drifted toward methods rather than ranks. No official record preserved it. No institution claimed it. The event did not belong to any organization that could benefit from public acknowledgement. And so it lived where such things often do, in memory, altered slightly by time, but never contradicted. Those who had been present rarely agreed on specifics. Some described the angle of movement differently. Others remembered the distance closing in their own way. A few insisted nothing visible had happened at all. But all agreed on the same point. After that day, arguments changed. In the years that followed, certain instructors in Seoul began adjusting how they taught. Not openly, not all at once. Stances became less rigid. Movements shortened. Demonstrations ended sooner. Explanations grew quieter. There was no reference to that afternoon when these changes occurred. There did not need to be. The undefeated champion continued her career. She did not retreat from teaching. She did not renounce her discipline. But those who trained under her later noticed a difference, not in her standards, but in her emphasis. Precision remained. Discipline remained. What softened was insistence. She began asking students fewer questions about strength and more about timing. Fewer questions about dominance and more about balance. When asked why, she offered no story in response. Only silence. As for the man who had come and gone without ceremony, his absence became as instructive as his presence had been. He did not return to clarify. He did not follow up. He did not build narrative around the encounter. The lack of continuation ensured that the event could not be absorbed into myth through repetition. It remained unresolved by design. Over time, the story was told with fewer names and more pauses. Younger practitioners heard it as a caution, though no warning was spoken. Older ones recalled it as a turning point they could not fully articulate. What endured was not the idea of being defeated. What endured was the recognition that mastery could arrive without confrontation, leave without explanation, and alter belief without demanding agreement. Decades later, when asked about the most influential demonstrations they had ever witnessed, some instructors would hesitate before answering. Then, occasionally, they would mention an afternoon long ago, one without judges, without victory, without conclusion. They would say that nothing extraordinary had happened. And then they would fall silent, as if that statement contained more truth than any description could. Because legends are not formed by noise. They are formed by what remains after noise proves unnecessary. The floor of that hall has been replaced many times since. Walls repainted. Institutions reorganized. But among those who understand restraint, efficiency, and control, not as ideas, but as lived principles, the memory persists. Not as a story of winning, but as a reminder that the highest form of dominance leaves no need to continue, and that the most enduring lessons are the ones delivered once, quietly, and never repeated.